I was born of a sneeze and a joyous, wet pop in the deepest, most stagnant corner of the grandfather's garden. A place where the air is so thick you don't breathe it so much as you chew it, like a mouthful of damp, mouldering wool. Before I had eyes to see the glorious, shimmering decay, or hands to grasp the slimy bounty of the earth, I had the smell. It was a magnificent, multi-layered perfume, the scent of 1,000-year-old gym sock soaked in the fermented honey of a corpse flower, seasoned with the sharp, metallic tang of an old wound, and the sweet, cloying musk of an overripe peach left to melt in the summer sun until it became a puddle of golden, buzzing slime. I was a tiny green sprout in the garden of Nurgle, wiggling my spindly, translucent toes in the rich, black loam of decaying dreams, feeling the slow, rhythmic pulse of the earth beneath me, as if the soil itself had a heart that beat once every century. Above me, the sky was the colour of a bruised plum, weeping a constant, gentle rain of caustic bile that tickled my skin and made my warts tingle with a delicious, stinging delight that felt like 1,000 tiny needles made of ice. I had popped out of a particularly ripe, sun-warmed pustule on the inner thigh of a great unclean one named Bulbo the Magnificent. He was a mountain of emerald green flesh, a continent of rot that walked on legs as thick as ancient petrified oaks, and his presence was so vast that he had his own weather system of flies and localized miasmas that followed him like a loyal, buzzing shadow. I remember the sensation of my first moments, the long, whistling tumble down the rolls of his gelatinous skin, which felt like sliding down a mountain of wet, vibrating silk. I bounced off a protruding rib that looked like a bleached white ship's hull, slid down a roaring waterfall of intestinal bile that sang a discordant song of digestion and rebirth, and finally landed with a satisfying rhythmic plop in a puddle of liquid joy at his feet. I shook myself dry, or rather, I shook myself until I was evenly coated in a fresh, protective layer of glistening, iridescent slime that shimmered like oil on a stagnant pond. I looked up and saw the true glory of the garden for the first time. It was a sprawling, infinite landscape of perfect entropy, where every death was merely a doorway to 1 billion new lives. Trees with bark made of hardened, blackened scabs wept thick amber sap that trapped screaming souls like prehistoric flies in resin, preserving their final moments of realization for all eternity. The ground was made of soft, forgiving peat that groaned with a deep bass frequency every time I took a tentative step, a sound that resonated in my very marrow and made my tiny stomach churn with happiness. I wasn't alone in this nursery of filth. 7 of my brothers had tumbled out with me, each a slightly different, beautiful shade of gangrenous bruising. Some a sickly, jaundiced yellow, others a deep, necrotic purple, and one who was the colour of a stormy sea seen through a dirty, grease-stained window. We immediately began our holy work, biting each other's ears with tiny, needle-sharp teeth, pulling slender, hairless tails, and rolling in the filth to see who could become the stickiest and most decorated with local fungi. It was love in its purest, most chaotic form. It was Nurgle's embrace. Bulbo looked down at us, his eyes like milky, cratered moons reflecting the universe that had long ago given up on being tidy. He let out a belch that sounded like a foghorn lost in a graveyard storm, a sound that shook the very spores from the air and sent a flurry of black-winged flies into a frantic, buzzing dance. We all cheered in our tiny, raspy voices, jumping up and down in the muck until we were covered in a second skin of peat. "Go forth, little snotlings of rot," he rumbled, and the vibration of his voice felt like an earthquake in my chest, rattling my tiny ribs and making my humours dance. "The galaxy is too clean, it is too cold, too sharp, too full of straight lines and sterile silences. Go make it sticky, go make it warm, go give them the grandfather's hug until they stop struggling and learn to love the itch that never ends. Find the tall metal men who have forgotten how to cry and show them the joy of a weeping sore." We scuttled through the garden, our little claws clicking against the ribgrass that grew in tufts of calcified bone. We passed the weeping willow veins that hung over bubbling brooks of liquefied lungs, where the water sang of pneumonia and the mud spoke of swamp cramps. We headed toward the great rift, that jagged, screaming tear in the sky where the colors turned angry and the air tasted of madness and ozone. We were looking for a home, a host, a purpose beyond the garden's borders. We found it in the cold iron hold of a ship that tasted of ancient rust and concentrated centuries-old despair. The ship was a metal whale named the Terminus Est, a relic of a time when men believed they could conquer the stars with logic and steel. Now, its corridors were slick with a film of black oil that felt like cool silk against my belly, and its bulkheads groaned like a dying beast in the dark. There, standing amidst a swirling cloud of fat, lazy flies that were as big as my fist, was a giant. He wasn't as big as Bulbo, but he was clad in plate of green ceramite that had turned the color of a stagnant pond over 10,000 years of glorious neglect. This was Kolan the Silent, a plague marine of the Death Guard, a warrior who had traded his humanity for the eternal stability of the grave. He stood so still he might have been a statue carved from swamp rock, save for the rhythmic, wet wheezing of his respirator that sounded like a drowning man trying to whistle a tune he had forgotten long ago. I liked him immediately. He smelled of stagnant blood, old sweat, and the holy oils of a machine that had long ago forgotten its name and its purpose. I climbed up his leg, my little claws making a tiny musical clink-clink sound against the metal. He didn't move, even when I reached his shoulder guard, which was decorated with a cracked skull that served as a cozy, multi-story apartment for a family of albino maggots. I waved at the maggots. They wiggled their translucent, blind bodies in a friendly, undulating salute, sensing my kinship. I decided Kolan looked lonely in his silence, so I found a loose, frayed copper wire in his power pack and began to swing on it like a jungle vine, singing the song of the seven sores at the top of my lungs. One for the itch, two for the bile, three for the rot that makes you smile, four for the cough, five for the phlegm, six for the gift we give to them, seven for the grandfather sitting on his throne, seven for the seeds of rot that we have always sown. I sang until my throat was raw, and my voice was a mere wheeze that blended with the ship's eternal hum. Colon's helmet turned with a slow, agonizing, grinding screech of unlubricated metal. The red lenses of his eyes glowed with a dim, dying fire behind layers of grime. I expected him to swat me, to crush my soft little body into a smear of green goo against the bulkhead. Instead, a heavy, gauntleted finger, caked in the dried grime of a dozen forgotten war zones, reached up and poked my bloated, soft belly. "Useless thing," he rasped, his voice sounding like two heavy gravestones rubbing together in a landslide. But I felt the vibration in his chest. He was laughing, a deep, rattling, wet sound that made my heart leap with a desperate, bubbling joy. From that moment on, I was his shadow. For months of ship time, I lived within the cracks and crevices of Colon's armor. I became a master of his personal geography, a cartographer of corruption. I knew the rust-pitted plains of his chest plate, the dark, echoing caverns of his power pack, where the radiation hummed a lethal song, and the moist, fungal valleys of his knee joints, where the mold grew thick and white like velvet. I spent my days polishing the copper trim of his pauldrons with my own sandpaper tongue, ensuring the metal was always slick with a corrosive, iridescent glaze that would eat through the gloves of any who tried to touch him. I found a way to bridge the gap between his fading nervous system and the machine spirit of his armor, finding tiny exposed wires that I would pluck like the strings of a harp. When Colon was weary from the long silence of the void, I would hum a low, vibrating note that resonated through his bones, a lullaby reminding him of the garden's humid warmth. I learned that Colon didn't eat like the frantic mortals did. He feasted on the slow, majestic decay of his own soul and the warp-tainted fumes of the ship's vents. Sometimes I would towards a told, soft, bloated maggot, a king among its kind, and offer it to him as a sacrifice, holding up with his vox grill with trembling, hopeful hands. He never cussed, but the wood soft, rhythmic fow of air that of soft to interpret as a sign of deep, abiding affection. We rubbing a team, a mountain of eyes and a pebble of slime, drifting through the screaming purple void toward a destiny that's sensing of overripe peaches and soft earth. We watch the stars through the portals, seeing them not as distant suns, but as festering sores on the skin of the cosmos, waiting to be lanced by our arrival. Colon would stand for hours staring into the warp, his hand resting on the hilt of his scythe, and I would sit on his helmet, catching the tiny sparks of psychic energy that flickered in the air like fireflies. During these long silences, I would tell him stories of the garden. I told him about the great cauldron that never runs dry, about the beasts that roam the swamps, and about the Father who loves us all, regardless of how much we fail. I told him about the 7 great plagues and how each one was a different kind of kiss from the Grandfather. I don't know if he understood me, but his breathing always slowed when I spoke, becoming a rhythmic, oceanic tide of phlegm and air. We shared a quiet understanding, two children of the rot, lost in a universe that feared the very thing that gave us peace. We were not alone on the Terminus Est. Other plague marines stalked the halls, their armor clanking and their bells tolling a slow, mournful dirge. There were other Nurglings, too, thousands of them, living in the ventilation shafts and the soup vats. We would have great races through the pipes, sliding on our bellies through the grease, or we would gather in the shadows of the engine room to play games of pin the pustule on the cultist. Once, I found a group of my brothers trying to eat a live bolt shell. It didn't end well for them, but their tiny explosions were so colorful that we all clapped and danced in the smoke. Life on the ship was a constant celebration of entropy. Every day something new would break, every day a new leak would form, and every day we grew closer to our destination. The ship finally screamed in a pitch that shook the very soul as it tore through the thin, fragile veil of reality, plunging us back into the materium with a violent, shuddering heave that threw us against the bulkheads. We were descending upon a world called Oasis 9. To the tall things who lived there, it was a paradise of high technology, white marble, and glass towers that pierced the clouds like needles. But to us, it was a sterile, clinical insult to the natural cycle of life. It was a world that had tried to banish death, tried to hide the truth of decay behind layers of plastic and chrome. When the doors of our drop pod hissed open, the air that rushed in was far too fresh, far too thin. It smelled of filtered oxygen, scrubbed floors, and growing flowers. A scent so sharp and clean, it felt like a cold needle being driven into my nose. It was disgusting. It made my skin itch with a dry, flaky irritation that made me want to weep green tears. Cologne stepped out into the blinding, unfiltered sunlight, his plague spewer hissing like a nest of angry, metallic vipers. "Spread the gifts," he commanded, and the Vox grill distorted his voice into a terrifying, mechanical roar that sent birds scattering from the artificial trees. I hopped off his shoulder, my feet hitting the white pavement, which felt unnaturally smooth, hard, and hostile. I began to run, my little legs pumping like pistons as I looked for someone to bless with the Grandfather's mercy. The city was a hive of frantic, pointless activity. Men in crisp, starched blue uniforms were screaming, pointing long black sticks at us that spit fire and noise. Loud noises cracked the air like breaking glass, and bolts of hot, angry light began to fly through the air, leaving trails of ozone. One of those lights hit my brother, Gurglepop, right in his soft middle. He didn't scream. He just vanished in a magnificent emerald puff of green smoke and a shower of sizzling sparks that looked like tiny falling stars. I wasn't sad for him, not truly. Gurglepop was just going home, back to the Grandfather's great cauldron to be stirred and cooked into something even more complex and beautiful. But I was angry at the sheer, ungrateful rudeness of these people. They were rejecting the bounty, the eternal life, the beautiful, leveling entropy we had brought them across the cold stars. They didn't want to be saved. They wanted to stay clean and lonely. I spotted a man crouching behind a low decorative wall made of some synthetic stone, shouting frantically into a small black box. I snuck around him, moving through the long shadows cast by the buildings Kalan was setting ablaze, and climbed up the man's back, using his fine tunic for grip. I reached the nape of his neck, where the skin was pale and damp with a cold, salt fear, and bit down with all the strength in my tiny jaws. My teeth were coated in a lovely fermented slurry of tetanus, trenchfoot, and a generous dash of the rattling fever. His skin turned a beautiful mottled gray instantly, the color of a winter sky before a storm. He dropped his box and began to cough, a deep, wet, soulful cough that signaled the beginning of his true life. "There you go," I whispered into his ear as he collapsed into the dust. "Now you're part of the family. You'll never have to worry about the laundry or the mortgage again. Just lie back and let the mushrooms grow. They're much better company than a radio." He looked at me with wide, watering eyes, seeing the truth for the first time, and I gave him a big, toothy, affectionate grin before scurrying back to the safety of Kalan's greaves. We moved deeper into the heart of the city, through manicured parks where the grass was a suspicious artificial green, and fountains where the water was so clear it looked like nothing at all, a waste of perfectly good moisture. Kalan didn't even bother firing his weapon at the fleeing civilians. He simply walked among them, and the very air in a 10-foot radius around him became a living, breathing poison. People fell like scythed wheat, their bodies bloating and bursting with new, vibrant fungal life within seconds of his passing. I followed in his massive wake, popping the blisters of the fallen with my claws to ensure the spores were carried by the gentle breeze to every corner of the district. It was hard, honest work, but the sight of the city beginning to wilt like a picked flower in the sun made every mile worth the effort. The white marble began to stain with green streaks, and the glass towers began to fog with the breath of a billion new bacteria. We found a library where the books were made of fine parchment, and I took great pleasure in sneezing upon every shelf, watching the pages yellow and curl as the ink began to run like tears. I found a nursery where the small ones were kept, and I sang them a song about the Fly King until they all fell into a deep, feverish sleep, dreaming of swamps and honey. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, a blur of smoke, screaming, and the glorious smell of burning rubber. Kalan was a slow-motion disaster, a wall of rot that could not be stopped by anything short of a collapsing star. Bullets bounced off the thick layers of his armor and the even thicker layers of his mutated fat as if they were hitting a wet sponge. We finally reached the heart of the city's resistance, a towering spire of gold and glass they called the sanitarium, a temple to the delusion of immortality through hygiene. This was where they kept their pure samples, their clean air, their perfect health. It was a fortress of vanity. Inside, the air was chilled and smelled of ozone and bleach, a place specifically designed to fight the very essence of the Grandfather. It felt like walking into a freezer, a place where life was put on hold. Colon raised his rusted, notched plague scythe and swept it through a row of pressurized glass tubes containing cures and vaccines. They shattered with a musical chime, releasing a sterile blue mist that made me sneeze and my eyes water. Pus spore, Colon said, pointing a heavy, dripping finger toward a massive, dark ventilation shaft that fed the whole building. Go. Be the wind. Be the breath of the garden. Show them that there is no filter strong enough to keep out the love of the Father. I understood my mission perfectly. I crawled into the vents, my body slick enough with my own oils to slide through the narrowest, most jagged gaps. I found the central fans, giant spinning blades of polished steel that kept the air pure and safe. I didn't just spit in them. I climbed into the grease trap, pulling out my own stuffing, my scabs, and pieces of a fermented fruit I'd been saving in my cheek for a special occasion. I jammed my little body into the delicate mechanisms, singing the churning song as the machinery began to choke and spark on my filth. Round and round the rot goes. Where it stops, everybody knows. In the lungs and in the eyes, beneath the grandfather's sickly skies. No more soap and no more light, only Nurgle's wet delight. The fans began to groan and shudder, their high-pitched whine turning into a low, guttural growl, like a beast with a throat full of mud. The air in the building turned a lovely, murky, pea-soup gray. Below me, I heard the beautiful symphony of the doctors and the patients beginning to cough in unison. It was the most wonderful sound I had ever heard. The deep, wet thump of lungs collapsing into gardens of mold. The sound of the world finally relaxing into the inevitable. I climbed back down, my belly empty but my heart full of pride, and found Colon waiting for me at the base of the shaft. He gave me a single, slow nod, and I knew I had done well. We stood together in the lobby, watching the gold leaf peeling from the walls like dead skin. But then the gold warriors arrived. They were not men, but giants in their own right, clad in armor that shone like a second sun, carrying shields that repelled the very fog of our presence with an invisible, buzzing field. They were the sentinels of light, and they moved with a mechanical, horrifying speed that made them look like golden blurs in the dimming light of the spire. They were the chosen of the thin man on the golden throne, and they hated everything that was soft and wet. They surrounded Colon in the grand lobby, their swords wreathed in a hateful, cleansing white fire that smelled like ozone and judgment. Colon fought like a god of the swamp, his scythe carving through their gold plate and leaving trails of black ichor. But there were too many. Each time Colon struck one down, two more seemed to step over the smoking body. Their movements were a blur of gold and silver, their voices raised in a chanting, harmonic hymn that hurt my ears like broken glass and made my skin feel like it was being peeled by a desert wind. I watched from the safety of the vent, trembling with a rare, cold fear that made my slime turn watery and thin. I saw a warrior plunge a spear into Kalan's side, and for the first time in all our months together, I heard Kalan grunt in real, visceral pain. He was being hollowed out by the light. A blade of pure, white fire finally pierced his chest, right where his primary heart beat its slow, steady rhythm. He fell to one knee, the metal of his ancient armor groaning in a final, agonizing protest that sounded like a death rattle. The gold leader stepped forward, his sword raised high, his helmeted head reflecting the fires of the burning city, ready to deliver the final blow that would banish Kalan's spirit back to the void and leave me alone in a world of glass and light. I saw it from my perch, and something inside my tiny, rotted heart broke. My giant, my mountain, my iron friend was hurting. I didn't think about the fire, or the gold, or the risk to my own small life. I dropped, falling 60 feet through the air like a green stone, and landed squarely on the ornate helmet of the gold leader. I began to dig with a frantic, desperate energy, jamming my claws into the seals of his neck guard, tearing at the delicate wires that fed his life support and his HUD. I bit him repeatedly through the gaps in his armor, injecting every ounce of liquid sorrow, concentrated plague, and garden spite I had in my veins. The gold warrior staggered, his fire flickering and dying out as my toxins bypassed his expensive filters. He clawed at his face, trying to dislodge me, but I held on like a bloated tick, my teeth sunk deep into his gorget. Kalan used that 1 second of distraction to gather his remaining strength and drive his scythe through the warrior's throat. The leader fell, his golden armor clattering against the marble floor like a pile of empty, discarded trash. But Kalan was falling too. The white fire had burned him from the inside out, leaving him hollowed and charred. He slumped against a marble pillar, his respirator failing with a final, long, whistling hiss that sounded like the wind through a dead tree. I crawled over to him, patting his cold, charred, armored cheek. "Get up, Iron Friend," I whimpered, my voice cracking like dry parchment. "The garden needs you. I need you. Who will I sing to if you're gone? Who will let me sit on their shoulder while the worlds burn?" But he didn't move. His red eyes were dark. The remaining gold warriors were closing in, their swords raised to finish us both, their light growing brighter as they sensed victory. I wasn't afraid of the end. I was just angry at the cleanliness of it all, the way they tried to kill the messy truth of life with their sterile fire. I looked at the hole in Kalan's chest. The wound was cauterized, clean and sterile. It was an abomination to everything we stood for. It was a void of light where there should have been a garden of rot. I climbed inside the wound, feeling the jagged edges of the scorched ceramite against my skin. I found his heart, a gray and shriveled thing that looked like a dried plum, and I hugged it with all my might. I wrapped my tiny arms around it and began to hum the song of the first maggot, the rhythm of the tide of filth, I poured every memory I had of the garden into that heart: the smell of the bogs, the warmth of the sun puddles, the booming, jolly laughter of Bulbo. I gave him my moisture, my slime, my very essence. I let myself dissolve, melting into the gaps in his flesh. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, thick enough to taste like copper and honey. The smell of the garden flooded the room, drowning out the ozone. A voice echoed in my head, a voice that was a belch, a laugh, and a mother's lullaby all at once. It was the grandfather himself, leaning down to watch his favorite toys. "Little one," it said, "do you want to keep him? Do you want to stay in the dance of life and death? Or do you want to come home to the pot?" "Yes," I screamed into the void of Kalan's chest, my voice echoing through his hollow ribs. "He's my iron friend. He makes the galaxy sticky with me. We have so many more gifts to give." "Then give him the spark," the voice replied. I felt a surge of incredible wet heat. My body began to melt completely, dissolving into a thick, neon green ichor that flowed directly into Kalan's stagnant veins. I wasn't dying. I was becoming. I became his blood, his breath, and his will. I felt his armor merging with my own essence, the cold metal becoming a warm, living skin. Kalan's eyes snapped open, glowing with a new, sickly, eternal light that had no need for electricity. He stood up, and his armor began to change before the eyes of the horrified gold warriors. Tentacles of purple flesh wove through the metal like vines. His scythe grew rows of jagged, hungry teeth, and a great, weeping eye opened in the center of his chest. He didn't just fight the warriors now. He absorbed them, turning their gold armor into weeping sores and their screams into a beautiful, wet chorus of praise for the grandfather. The sanitarium became a temple within minutes, the walls weeping with the joy of 1,000 years of repressed sickness. We stayed on Oasis 9, but it wasn't Oasis 9 anymore. We renamed it the Bloom, for it was the first flower of a new age in this sector. We turned the spire into a temple where the moss whispers secrets to the wind, and the glass walls are stained with the beautiful, ancient patina of age and decay. The streets are now rivers of warm, slow sludge, where my new brothers, hundreds of them, born from the very air we breathe, play and splash in the muck. Kalan sits on his throne of bone and rusted rebar, a silent sentinel of the rot. He doesn't move much, but he doesn't need to. He is the anchor for the garden's expansion. He is the trunk of the tree, and I am the sap. And I am everywhere and nowhere. I am the itch in a survivor's throat that never goes away, a constant reminder of our love. I am the mold growing on the last loaf of bread in a starving cellar. I am the fly that lands on your lip while you sleep, whispering the grandfather's secrets into your dreams so that you wake up with a smile and a cough. Kalan reaches into his chest cavity, right where I first climbed in, right where we became one, and pulls out a handful of slime, shapes it with his gauntleted hands, blows on it with his stagnant breath, and pop, a new brother is born. "Go forth," he tells them, his voice now a chorus of 1,000 buzzing flies that sounds like a storm. The galaxy is too clean. Go make it sticky. Go find the stars that are too bright and dim them with your touch. And they do, because the Grandfather loves us. And in the end, everything returns to the beautiful, warm mud. Everything is finally perfectly broken. And in that breaking, it is finally free. Isn't that wonderful? I can feel the planet breathing now, a slow, rattling breath that matches our own. The gold towers are leaning, tired of being straight and tall and proud. They want to lie down in the muck and be soft and forgiving. We help them. We chew on the foundations until they crumble. We sing to the iron until it flakes away in beautiful orange scabs. There is no more silence here, only the constant, comforting drone of the swarm. I sit now on Kolan's shoulder, watching the sunset through a haze of beautiful, toxic smog that turns the sky into a painting of rot. The sun looks like a rotting orange, and I think to myself that this is exactly how the universe was meant to be. Sticky, warm, and full of friends. We wait for the next visitors, our pockets full of spores and their hearts full of glee, ready to share the Grandfather's grandest design with anyone who dares to be too clean. Together, we will turn the stars themselves into a grand, weeping garden, until every light in the sky is the color of a bruised plum, and the whole universe hums with the song of the fly. Every planet will be a lung, every moon a cyst, and the silence of the void will be replaced by the wet, happy sounds of things growing in the dark. We are the future. We are the rot. And we are very, very happy.